Blizzard buried and barely breathing, a cry rose thin beneath the wind that night, and answering it would change everything Josiah Kane believed about the strangers the saloon men in town had warned him against. He had been riding for home for 2 hours already, bent low against a Montana storm that had swallowed the trail an hour before sunset. And if his horse had not planted its feet and refused to take another step, he would have ridden past the sound and never known what he left behind him in the snow. Stay with me for this one, because it is not the kind of story you forget the moment the credits roll. A man with nothing left to prove to anyone. A mother with nothing left to give. A baby whose next breath was not a certainty. What happened between the three of them on the worst night of their lives would not end at dawn. It would come back around the following spring, riding over a ridge onto Josiah Kane's own land, in a way none of them could have imagined while they were still fighting just to survive the dark. I will tell you all of it, from the first cry in the wind to the last one, so stay close and let me know in the comments where you are watching this from tonight. Before we go any further, I want to ask you for something small. If a story like this one is worth your time, tap the join button beside the channel name and become a channel member. It helps keep stories like this one alive, and it means more to us than you might think. Josiah Kane was 34 years old that winter of 1887, and he had built the kind of life a man builds when he has decided that company is more trouble than it is worth. His homestead sat 11 miles outside the nearest settlement, a scatter of buildings called Elkhorn Crossing that barely earned the name of a town, tucked against the shoulder of the Absaroka foothills, where the wind came down off the high country with nothing left to slow it. He ran 400 head of cattle with the help of one hired man who lived in town and rode out only when the work demanded it. And he had built his own cabin with his own 2 hands the summer he turned 26, notching every log himself because he did not trust another man to fit the corners tight enough to hold heat through a Montana January. He had not always preferred his own company. There had been a wife once, a gentle Ohio girl named Clara, who had followed him west with more courage than sense, and a fever had taken her in her second winter on the ranch, before they had managed to have children, before Josiah had learned how to say the things a man is supposed to say, and too often waits too long to say them. He had buried her on a rise behind the cabin, with a view of the valley she used to claim reminded her of nothing she had ever seen back home. And in the 6 years since, he had let the ranch and the work and the long, silent evenings fill up the space where a family should have been. Men in town called him solitary, and some called him hard, and Josiah had stopped correcting either description because both were close enough to true that arguing felt like wasted breath. He kept a good fire, a full larder, and a locked door on the part of himself that still ached some nights when the wind sounded, for just a moment, like footsteps he was never going to hear again. The nearest homestead to his own belonged to a widower named Ellery, 4 miles east, and beyond that the country simply emptied out, a long, wind-scoured stretch of foothill and coulee that most families had given up trying to settle years before Josiah ever arrived. He liked it that way more often than he admitted out loud. A man alone in country like that learned to read the sky the way another man might read a letter, learned which cloud banks meant an hour's warning and which ones meant none at all. And Josiah had trusted his own reading of the sky for 8 winters running without it ever once failing him badly enough to matter. That afternoon it very nearly had. That afternoon he had ridden into Elkhorn Crossing for salt and coffee and a new set of harness buckles, and the storekeeper had warned him twice to wait the weather out, jabbing a thumb at a sky gone the color of a day-old bruise pressing down over the foothills. Josiah had thanked him for the warning and gone anyway, because he had cattle scattered in the low country that needed moving before the storm sealed the passes for good, and because waiting out a blizzard in a warm room had never once in his life felt better to him than going out and meeting it. He made it 4 miles before the snow turned from a warning into a wall, and by the time the light started dying, He could no longer see the fence line he had ridden 100 times before, could no longer tell with any confidence where his own land ended and the wild country began. The wind was the worst of it, a driving, keening thing that came at him sideways and found every gap his coat had to offer. And his horse fought the storm with its head down and its ears pinned flat, picking a path more by memory than by any sight at all. Josiah had nearly given up trying to see and had let the animal find its own way home when it stopped dead in a stand of rock and scrub pine, ears swiveling hard, refusing to move another step no matter how he pressed it. He was about to swing down and lead it through by hand when he heard the sound again. And this time there was no mistaking it, and his blood went cold in a way the storm alone had not managed to accomplish. It was a cry, small and weak and fading, carried sideways on the wind from somewhere among the rocks to his left. And no coyote and no wounded animal made a sound shaped quite like that one. Josiah swung down into snow that came past his knees and pushed toward the rocks with his heart slamming against his ribs, calling out into the storm though he doubted anyone could hear him over the wind. And it was the stillness that followed the cry that frightened him worse than the cry itself. Because stillness in a blizzard usually meant the worst had already come and gone. He found her in the lee of the rocks, curled so tightly around a small bundle that at first, in the failing light, he mistook the shape of her for a drift the wind had carved and abandoned. She was young, dark-haired, dressed for a milder day than the one the sky had delivered, and she did not stir when his boots broke the crust of snow beside her. For one terrible instant, Josiah thought he had come too late for both of them. Then her eyes opened, glassy and slow to focus, and her arms tightened around the bundle at her chest with whatever strength was left in her. And he understood in that single motion everything he needed to know about who she was and what she had been trying to do out here, alone in the storm. She flinched from him as best a half-frozen body can flinch, drawing the baby tighter against her, and Josiah stopped where he stood, hands rising slowly, empty, palms open to the gray sky. He had heard the stories men told in the saloon about Apache raiding parties, about trouble along the frontier that never seemed to get told the same way twice, depending on who was doing the telling. And he had learned over the years that saloon stories were built more out of fear than out of fact. What was in front of him now was not a story. It was a woman doing the only thing a mother knows how to do at the very end of her strength, which is to keep her own body between her child and the cold for as long as her body will allow it. "Your baby needs warmth," he told her, low and slow, the way he would talk to a spooked horse, and he did not move any closer until something in her exhausted eyes told him she had understood the shape of what he meant, even if the words themselves meant nothing to her. She loosened her arms by a fraction, just enough for him to see the small face beneath the wrappings, still and silent in a way that stole the air out of Josiah's chest, until he caught the faintest rise and fall beneath the blankets. Alive. Barely, but alive. He shrugged out of his heavy wool coat with hands already going numb and wrapped it around both of them, mother and child together. And for a moment he thought that alone might be enough, that he could get them up onto his horse and be home inside the hour. But when he tried to lift her, her legs would not hold her weight, and the cold had taken so much from her already that she could barely keep her head upright. And Josiah understood, with a sinking certainty, that his horse, already spent from fighting the storm this far, could not safely carry the three of them the miles that remained. One rider, exhausted and half-blind in a whiteout, risked all three lives on a single misstep. He made his decision standing in the snow, with the wind trying to steal the breath from his lungs before he could even finish drawing it in. He was going to walk. He tied the reins around his own wrist so the horse would follow rather than bolt, and he tucked the baby inside his own shirt and coat against the bare warmth of his chest, small and impossibly light, and shivering in a way that frightened him worse than gunfire ever had. He got his free arm under the mother's shoulders and lifted, taking as much of her weight as his legs could carry, and together, in a strange, staggering, three-legged rhythm neither of them had chosen, and neither of them could have managed alone, they started forward into the storm. If you are finding yourself pulled into this one already, that is exactly why I wanted to tell it. Consider becoming a member of this channel. Tap Join beside the name. It costs you nothing extra to watch, and it is a small thing that helps keep frontier stories like this one coming. The walk that followed was 11 miles of the kind of cold that stops being a feeling and becomes something closer to a fight. The snow came to Josiah's shins and then his knees in the drifted stretches, and the wind never once let up, driving ice crystals sideways into any bare skin it could find. And more than once he lost the trail entirely and had to stop, breathing hard, letting the horse's instinct for home guide him back onto the line before he pushed forward again. The woman stumbled beside him again and again, her strength failing faster than his own. And each time she went down, he caught her before her knees could reach the snow. And each time she tried, out of some stubborn pride he recognized, because he carried a version of it himself, to push away from him and stand on her own 2 feet. "Keep moving," he told her, more than once, his voice rough with the cold and the effort of it. Just a little farther. She did not understand the exact shape of the words, but something in his tone must have carried the meaning across whatever distance stood between their 2 languages, because each time she nodded and found some last reserve to keep her feet moving beneath her. Once she spoke to him in her own tongue, a rush of words too fast and too frightened for him to catch even a single one of them, and he answered the only way he knew how, not with words that matched hers, but with words that meant the same thing underneath. "I know you're scared," he said. "I've got you. Just keep walking. 1 step and then the next one." The snow deepened where the trail dipped through a stand of cottonwoods, and twice Josiah had to stop and get his bearings by the shape of the land under his boots, rather than by anything his eyes could tell him. Because the world had narrowed down to gray wind and white ground, and the 2 lives he was carrying through the middle of it. His arms had long since gone past aching into something closer to numb, and still he kept his grip locked around her shoulders. Still he kept one hand pressed flat against the small shape beneath his coat, because letting go, even for a moment to flex a cramping hand, felt like a risk neither of them could afford. Halfway through that terrible hour, the baby made a small sound against his chest, a thin, complaining cry that Josiah had never in his life been so grateful to hear, because it meant the child was still fighting, still drawing breath, still alive enough to protest the cold the way any healthy baby ought to protest it. The mother's head came up sharply at the sound, her exhausted eyes going wide, and when she saw Josiah's hand press protectively over the bundle at his chest, shielding it as best he could from the worst of the wind, something in her face broke open. Relief and gratitude tangled together too tightly to pull apart. "Your child is safe," he told her, and whether or not she understood every single word, she understood enough, because for the first time since he had found her, she let herself lean into him instead of fighting to stand entirely on her own. She stumbled hard not long after, her legs simply giving out beneath her all at once, and this time when Josiah caught her, he did not set her back on her feet. He gathered her up instead, one arm beneath her knees and the other supporting her back, the baby still tucked warm against his chest between them. And when she made a small sound of protest, too proud even now to be carried like something breakable, he shook his head. "I'm carrying you," he said, in a voice that left no real room for argument. And something in her simply stopped fighting him, too exhausted and, he thought, too grateful underneath the exhaustion to keep pretending she did not need the help. For the better part of an hour after that, Josiah Kane carried both of them through a Montana blizzard, his shoulders burning, his legs shaking with a bone-deep fatigue he had not felt since his hardest years breaking horses, his hands numb around her weight and the horse's reins both. He went down twice himself, once to one knee, once nearly all the way to the snow, and both times he caught himself before he lost his grip on either of them, some reserve of stubbornness rising up from the same place that had gotten him through 6 winters alone on this land. He thought of nothing during that hour except the next step, and the one after that, and the small, warm weight against his chest that had gone quiet again, sleeping now rather than struggling, and the faint yellow light he kept praying would appear somewhere ahead of him in the dark. It appeared at last just past what felt like the outer edge of his own endurance, a single window glowing gold through the driving snow, his own cabin, closer than he had dared to let himself hope. The last quarter mile passed in a blur of relief and exhaustion, his legs moving now on habit alone, and when he finally shouldered the door open and stumbled inside out of the wind, the sudden stillness and warmth of the room felt almost violent after so many hours inside the storm. He laid her down as gently as his shaking arms allowed onto the braided rug in front of the hearth, and he lowered the baby beside her before he let himself straighten up. And for one long moment, he simply stood there, chest heaving, snow melting off him in sheets onto the floorboards, looking down at the 2 lives he had just carried 11 miles through a storm that had very nearly taken all 3 of them. Then he stopped looking and started working, because they were both still dangerously cold, and looking was a luxury that could wait until later, when there was time for it. He built up the fire until it roared, feeding it more wood than he would normally burn in a full evening, and he stripped the wet blankets from around them and wrapped them instead in every dry quilt and coat he owned, working with the brisk, careful hands of a man who had spent years doctoring sick calves and stubborn horses, and knew that panic never warmed anybody up any faster than patience did. He set water to heat and made a thin broth from the dried meat in his stores, and when it was warm enough not to scald, he coaxed a few spoonfuls between her lips, holding her head steady, watching her throat work to swallow. He rubbed her hands and her feet between his own, working the blood back into fingers gone waxy and pale, and he checked the baby's breathing again and again through the night, laying 2 fingers lightly against the small chest to feel the rise and fall for himself every time worry got the better of his patience. He did not sleep. He fed the fire every time it threatened to die down, and he gave her water whenever she stirred enough to take it, and he sat in his father's old chair pulled close to the hearth and watched the 2 of them breathe through the long hours of the storm, thinking, more than once, about Clara, about the winter that had taken her, about how a man could spend 6 years telling himself he preferred an empty cabin and still feel his chest crack wide open at the sight of 2 strangers sleeping safe by his fire because he had refused, at the one moment it mattered most, to leave them behind in the snow. Somewhere in the deepest part of that night, watching the baby's small chest rise and fall in the firelight, Josiah found himself thinking hard about the stories he had grown up hearing about her people. Stories traded over cards and whiskey by men who had never once ridden far enough from town to know a single Apache family by name. He had never fully believed those stories, not really, but he had let them sit unquestioned in some back corner of his mind for years, the way a man lets a fence post lean without ever straightening it, because straightening it took more effort than the lean seemed worth. There was nothing in the woman sleeping in front of his hearth that matched a single word of what he had half believed. There was only a mother who had walked into a killing storm because staying still meant certain death, and had very nearly paid for that walk with everything she had. He decided, sometime before the sky began to gray, that he was done letting that particular fence post lean. Near dawn, with the wind finally beginning to lose its edge outside the shuttered window, she woke. Josiah saw her eyes open in the low firelight, saw them go first, instantly, to the small shape sleeping peacefully beside her, and watched relief move through her whole body like something physical. A held breath finally let go. She looked up and found him watching from the chair, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing in either of their languages that needed saying just yet. Then she lifted one hand, still weak, and pressed it briefly to her own chest, and then reached it toward him, not quite touching, a gesture that seemed to carry something larger than simple thanks. Something Josiah did not have a word for either, before her exhausted body pulled her back down into sleep before she could finish whatever it was she had meant to tell him. He sat with that unfinished gesture a long while after her eyes had closed again, turning it over in his mind the way a man turns over a stone he cannot quite identify. And he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not want the morning to come, not if the morning meant she and the baby would be well enough to leave him. The storm broke fully by mid-morning, the wind dying to a whisper, the sky clearing to a hard, bright blue that made the snow blaze almost too bright to look at directly. Josiah went out to see to his horse, moving stiff and sore through drifts that had reshaped the whole yard overnight, and it was there, forking hay into the small barn, that he first heard it. Hoofbeats, many of them, muffled by snow but unmistakable, coming steady and deliberate from the ridge above his cabin. He straightened slowly, one hand going without thinking to the rifle he had left leaned against the barn door, and watched a line of riders come down off the high ground into the clearing, a dozen or more, moving with the careful, controlled discipline of people who had ridden this stretch of country before and knew exactly where they were going. His pulse climbed. He thought of every story he had ever half believed and half doubted, thought of the mother and child sleeping inside his cabin, and what it might mean if these riders had come looking for trouble instead of looking for them. And his hand tightened around the rifle stock, even as some steadier part of him told him to wait, to watch, before he did anything he could not take back later. The riders slowed as they reached the yard, and an older man swung down first, gray-streaked hair beneath a wide-brimmed hat, moving toward the cabin with an urgency that had nothing careful about it at all. And then the cabin door opened, and she stepped out into the bright cold morning on legs still unsteady, the baby held close against her chest, and the sound the old man made at the sight of her was not the sound of a warrior looking for a fight. It was the sound of a father who had feared the very worst and found, against every likelihood, that the worst had not come to pass after all. He crossed the yard in a half-run and gathered her and the child both into his arms, and Josiah, still standing by the barn with the rifle no longer feeling like the right thing to be holding, watched an entire family's worth of grief and terror dissolve in the space of a few seconds into something closer to disbelief and joy. Riders dismounted around them, crowding close, reaching out to touch the baby's small face, to confirm with their own eyes and hands that both mother and child had survived a night that by any reasonable measure they should not have survived at all. It was the old man, her father, who turned to Josiah at last, and Josiah, still holding the rifle loosely down at his side, braced himself for whatever was coming next, anger or accusation or something worse, because that was what 6 years of half-believed saloon talk had taught him to expect from a moment like this one. Instead, the older man walked toward him slowly, stopped an arm's length away, and lowered his head, not in submission, but in something Josiah recognized immediately, without needing a single word of translation, as respect, plain and unhurried. Josiah, after a beat of stunned hesitation, returned the gesture as best he understood it, and set the rifle down against the barn wall, where it had no further business being that morning. She came forward then, still weak but steady enough now to stand and to speak, and though her English was halting, learned in fragments from traders and soldiers over the years, it carried more than enough weight to say what needed saying. "You carried his daughter and her baby through the storm," she said, her hand resting lightly on the old man's arm. "My father is Ahiga. He wishes you to know he will not forget it, not for the rest of his life." Josiah, feeling suddenly and uncharacteristically clumsy with words, shook his head. "I just did what anyone should have done," he said. "Anyone who found you out there would have done the same thing I did." Her expression, gentle but certain, told him plainly that she did not agree with that, and that no amount of modesty on his part was going to change what she and her father believed about that night and what it had cost him. Ahiga reached up and drew a small carved pendant from around his own neck, A piece of polished stone worked with care into the shape of a bird in flight, and pressed it into Josiah's hand, closing his fingers around it when Josiah hesitated to accept a gift that felt, in the moment, far larger than anything he believed he had done to earn it. Around them, one by one, the other riders dismounted fully and came forward, not with weapons, not with wariness, but with the quiet, deliberate courtesy of people paying respect to a man who had done right by one of their own, when it would have been so much easier for him to have done nothing at all. "You saved my baby," Nita told him later, once the yard had settled and the fire inside had been built back up to warm the whole party through. Her voice steadier now, her English coming easier the more she used it. Josiah considered that for a moment before he answered. "Your baby saved me too," he said finally, and meant it more than he had expected to when the words first left him. "I nearly gave up out there in that storm, more than once. Carrying your child gave me a reason to keep walking when I wasn't sure I had one left in me on my own." Her name, he learned that morning, was Nita, and the baby, a girl not yet 4 months old, was named for her grandmother, and her father, the man who had lowered his head to a stranger without a moment's hesitation, was a respected leader among his people, a man whose whole bearing carried the weight of decades spent protecting the family and the land both. The party stayed through that day and into the next, resting the horses, letting Nita regain enough strength for the ride home, and in those 2 quiet days something took root between Josiah and the small, watchful woman he had carried through a blizzard that neither of them had yet found the right words to fully name. She followed him as he did his chores, the baby wrapped and warm against her now, and though conversation between them was halting, built out of gestures and simple borrowed words, and more patience than either of them had shown a stranger in years, they found they understood each other well enough for it to matter. She laughed, once, at the sight of him wrestling a stubborn calf back into its pen. A real laugh, unguarded, and the sound of it did something to Josiah's chest he had not felt since long before Clara died. He found himself more than once watching her across the cabin in the evening firelight, the baby asleep against her shoulder, and thinking that his solitary life had never once, in 6 long years, looked quite so much like something worth changing after all. He told her, on the second evening, in the plain, halting way 2 people manage when they share only fragments of each other's language, about Clara, about the rise behind the cabin where she was buried, about the 6 years he had spent convincing himself that an empty house was easier to carry than a full one that might someday be emptied again. Nita listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she said only that grief and gratitude were not so different from one another, that both were simply a kind of love that had run out of places left to go. He thought about that long after the fire had burned low that night, and for the first time and longer than he could remember, the quiet of his own cabin did not feel like the safest place in the world to be. She taught him, in those 2 days, a handful of words in her own language, laughing gently at the shape his mouth made trying to catch sounds it had never once been asked to make. And he taught her, in turn, the names of his cattle and his horse, and the creek that ran along the eastern edge of his land. And somewhere in that clumsy, patient trading of words that neither of them fully owned, a friendship took a shape sturdier than either of them had expected on the night it began. Sturdier, Josiah thought privately, than most things built out of a shared language ever managed to be. On the second afternoon, while the baby slept swaddled near the fire, Nita took a small pouch of beads and sinew from among her few belongings and worked steadily at a strip of soft leather, her fingers quick and certain in a way that told Josiah this was old, familiar work, something her own mother had likely taught her, the same patient way Josiah's own father had once taught him to read a brand or splice a rope. She caught him watching and held the piece up for him to see, a narrow band worked with a simple pattern in red and white, and told him, in the plain words she had, that it was for the baby, something to carry when she was old enough to understand what that terrible night had cost and what it had given back. Josiah found himself oddly moved by the sight of it, by the quiet, unhurried skill of her hands, by the fact that even exhausted and far from home, she had not stopped being exactly who she was. He cooked for her that evening, badly by his own admission, a pot of beans and salt pork that was the best his larder had to offer. And Nita ate it without complaint and told him, through gestures more than words, that it was not the worst meal she had ever been served, which made him laugh out loud for the first time in longer than he could easily remember. It was a small, ordinary evening, 2 people and a sleeping baby and a fire burning low, and Josiah thought, watching her across the room, that he could not recall the last time an ordinary evening had felt quite so much like something worth keeping. If you have made it this far with me, thank you for staying through it. Tap the join button beside the channel name and become a member if you are able to. It helps this small channel keep telling stories about people who choose kindness, even when it costs them something real. And every one of you who joins makes a genuine difference to us. On the morning they finally rode out, Ahiga clasped Josiah's forearm in the manner of warriors sealing a bond rather than simply parting ways, and told him, through Nita's translation, that his family and his people would remember what had been done for them on that terrible night, and that the debt, though Josiah insisted there was no debt owed at all, would not go unanswered when the time came. Nita lingered a moment longer than the rest of the party. The baby settled warm against her chest and reached out to touch Josiah's arm before she turned for her horse, a small gesture that carried more weight than any of the words either of them had managed across 2 days of trying. She did not say goodbye so much as she told him, first in her own language and then haltingly in his, that they would see one another again, and something in the careful, certain way she said it made Josiah believe her completely. The winter that followed was quieter than any Josiah had known in years, but it no longer felt like the same kind of quiet it had been before. He found himself, more evenings than not, thinking of Nita and the baby, wondering how the 2 of them fared through the rest of the cold months, turning the small carved pendant over in his fingers by the fire, the way another man might turn over a letter he had read 100 times already and still was not finished with. He did not know, through those long winter evenings, whether he would ever see her again, only that something in him had shifted the night he chose to walk 11 miles through a blizzard rather than leave a stranger to die alone in the snow, and that shift had not undone itself once the storm finally passed. Spring came late that year, the thaw dragging its feet through a cold, wet April before the grass finally began greening along the low pastures. And with the spring came trouble of an entirely different kind. Rustlers had been working the country north of Elkhorn Crossing since the snow first started melting. 3 ranches hit already, good stock driven off in the dead of night before anyone could raise a proper alarm. And Josiah, working mostly alone with his one hired hand, knew his own herd made an easy enough target for men who had already proven they were not particular about whose cattle they took. He lost 11 head himself in a single night 2 weeks into the trouble, and lying awake afterward, he found himself, for the first time in a long while, genuinely uncertain whether he could hold the ranch together on his own, the way he always had before that winter. He was out at first light one morning, checking fence along the northern boundary where the rustlers had struck before, when he found tracks pressed into the soft spring mud that were not cattle tracks, and not the tracks of any horse he recognized from the county. He was still crouched over them, working out their direction, when he heard hoofbeats again, the same steady, deliberate rhythm he had heard once before on a snow-covered morning months earlier. And when he stood and looked toward the ridge, his breath caught in something that was not quite the same fear it had been that first time around. It was Ahiga, riding at the head of a dozen men, and behind him, unmistakable even at a distance, rode Nita, the baby now old enough to sit bundled in a carrier against her chest, her chin lifted, her whole bearing changed from the exhausted, frightened woman he had carried through the snow into something closer to the woman she must have been before that terrible night ever happened to her. They had not come by accident. Ahiga's scouts had crossed the rustlers' trail 2 days earlier, moving through the same stretch of country, and the moment the old man recognized whose land those tracks were circling, he had gathered his riders and come straight for Josiah Kane's ranch, without a single moment's hesitation. "They will hit your herd again within 2 nights, Ahiga told him, through Nita, once they had dismounted in the yard. "We know their number, and we know the draw where they mean to move your stock through. We have come to help you stop them before that happens, if you will have us." Josiah, standing in his own yard looking at a dozen mounted riders who had crossed miles of open country simply because they had heard trouble was circling a man who had once carried a stranger's daughter through a storm, felt something thick rise in his throat that took him a long moment to name as anything other than gratitude, too large for plain words to hold. Together they held the northern pass 2 nights later. Josiah and his hired man and Ahiga's riders positioned along the ridgeline in the dark, patient and silent, waiting on a moon too thin to give much away. When the rustlers came driving a small, stolen herd through the draw, exactly where Ahiga had said they would come, they rode straight into a line of men they had never once expected to find waiting for them there. There was no gunfire that night, only the sudden, silent appearance of a dozen mounted riders out of the darkness on every side at once, enough to convince even hardened cattle thieves that the odds had turned decisively against them. And by first light, the rustlers were gone from that stretch of country entirely, driven off without a single shot fired and without a single life lost on either side of it. Standing in the gray light of dawn afterward, his herd safe, his land quiet again, Josiah found Nita waiting by the horses, while the others saw to the recovered stock. The baby awake now, and watching him with the frank, unblinking curiosity only very small children manage to carry. Nita smiled at him, the same unguarded smile he remembered from that first long winter, and told him simply that her people did not forget a kindness once it was given, and that as long as he lived on this land, he would not stand alone again against whatever trouble came looking for him. Josiah Kane would say, years afterward, whenever anyone in Elkhorn Crossing asked him about the carved pendant he still wore beneath his shirt, or the friendship that had grown up between his ranch and the people who lived beyond the northern ridge, that the greatest thing he had ever earned in this life was not the pendant, and it was not the protection that came riding over his hills whenever trouble threatened him again. And it was not even the quiet, steady bond that grew between himself and Nita over the years that followed. Warm and unhurried, never once needing to be rushed into becoming something it was not yet ready to be. The greatest thing, he would say, was far simpler than any of that. It was knowing that on one terrible night, in a storm that should by all rights have taken 3 lives instead of none, he had refused to walk away. And because of that single choice, a mother and her daughter had lived to see every spring that came afterward. In the years that followed, Nita's people never once let the debt they believed they owed him go quiet. Every branding season, riders came down off the northern ridge to lend their hands to a job that used to take Josiah and his one hired man twice as long alone. And every autumn, before the first real cold set in, Ahiga rode out simply to sit by Josiah's fire a while and talk of small things, weather and horses, and the slow turning of the seasons, in the unhurried way of 2 men who trusted each other and felt no need to fill every silence between them. The baby girl Josiah had carried against his own chest through a blizzard grew, season by season, into a quick, sure-footed child who called him by a name in her mother's language that Nita told him, smiling, meant something close to the one who listened. And Josiah wore that small honor more proudly than he ever wore the pendant, though he never once took the pendant off either. Between himself and Nita, nothing was ever rushed, and nothing needed to be. She came to trust his land the way she trusted her own, and he came to look for the dust of her people's horses on the northern ridge, the way another man might look for the first green shoot of spring, a sign that the hardest part of the season had passed and something worth waiting for was finally on its way. Whatever grew between them grew slowly and honestly, built out of 2 winters and countless small kindnesses, rather than out of any single dramatic vow. And Josiah found, as the years piled up behind him, that he no longer thought of his cabin as a place of family should have been. He thought of it, more and more, as a place a family had found its way to after all, even if it did not look like the family he had once imagined for himself in his younger years. He kept the pendant close for the rest of his days, and every winter, when the first hard snow came down off the Absarokas, he thought of a faint cry beneath the wind that he very nearly rode straight past, and of how differently every single thing that followed might have gone if he had let the storm's noise cover the sound of it, instead of stopping, on instinct alone, to listen. Some nights, sitting by his own fire with the memory of that first long walk still vivid after all the years standing between him and it, he would think that the whole of a good life sometimes turns on nothing grander than one man's willingness to stop, to listen, and to carry what he finds.